Hi, I'm Joanne Banko from Let's Go Sew, and today I'm going to be showing you an embroidered vest that I made from scratch, and the embroidery is done with a very special type of embroidery design. So let's get started. First of all, let me talk a little bit about sewing from scratch. I do a lot of garment sewing, and I'm always trying out new patterns because that's part of the fun of it, trying out new patterns and seeing what works. And a lot of us, we struggle with fit sometimes. So I want to give you my first tip of the day, and that is to consider tracing your pattern onto pattern tracing cloth. Pattern tracing cloth can actually be stitched. So I trace off each pattern as if I was cutting out fabric, and then I sew the pieces together. I do a trial fit, and then any alterations that I need to make, I make right on my pattern tracing cloth, and then I use that for my pattern to cut my actual fabric. So you can actually see here with this shoulder, I needed just a little bit of a tuck in the shoulder. Other than that, everything fit pretty well perfect. So that's my first tip for you today. Now, let's talk about the fabric itself. I chose a pre-quilted fabric for this. The pattern actually that I selected was this one here, and it called for pre-quilted fabric. There's a lot of choices with that. In the outerwear department is generally speaking where you'll find that. And of course, if you want to do it yourself, you can do it yourself. But this is double-sided, so it's all quilted, through all layers. And I'll give you some tips for sewing that in a little bit. But let's talk about the embroidery. You want to see it? Let me turn this around. And there you go. Very special embroidery because this is done with yarn. So instead of embroidering with thread, I'm embroidering with yarn. And it's actually couching the yarn down. So I'm going to show you how to do that. I've got my fabric already hooped. If you take a look here, all of my embroidery is done prior to my construction, so I'm going to do that first. And what I want you to look at here is I chose my hoop based on the size of my back piece. This is my jacket, or my vest rather, center back piece. And because it was a little shy of fitting in the hoop, I added a layer of water-soluble stabilizer, because you always want your hoop to be filled with something so that stays nice and secure. Let me point out just a couple other things on the vest. Binding. I'm going to give you some tips on binding. You can buy pre-folded binding, and that's what I used. That, generally speaking, has a wider side on the back than it does on the front, so you always want to sew the front side to the front of your garment, and when it wraps around to the back and you do your top stitching, you're sure to catch that. You can also consider using other binding, see what you find that will coordinate with your fabric, and another option would be to use a good stretchy knit or possibly a rib knit, and you can use that for binding as well. Because it's a knit, it won't fray, and it makes it really easy to clean finish that edge. So let's go over to the machine, and I'm going to show you how I got that embroidery design. We're going to start by selecting embroidery. I'm going to touch set. I'm going to touch embroidery, and I am good to go and ready to sew. Let me tell you a little bit about setup while I'm getting this on the machine. I changed from my normal standard embroidery foot to a new couching foot. I added my yarn that I rolled off a little bit and then fed it right through the guides that are all designed exactly for that yarn to go there. Okay, and I'm ready to sew. So I'm going to lower the presser foot, and it's going to start stitching. So this will take just a few minutes to stitch. When it's done stitching, I'm going to actually show you some sewing techniques. So we'll stitch out the whole embroidery design, and then we'll switch over to sewing, and we'll be able to stitch that out. Now my design is done. You could see I chose a little bit of a different butterfly than I have on my original vest there, just a little bit smaller. I would very easily finish this by simply snipping a little extra of the yarn tail that's left, feed it down to the back side, tie it in a little knot, and I'm good to go, and it's all secure. Now I'm going to go ahead and change the machine over to sewing so I can give you some sewing tips and tricks. Okay, I've changed my machine over to sewing, so let's talk just a minute here about the garment construction. I told you about the binding, I gave you some tips on that. That's where our zipper is going to be inserted. So very often it's a little tricky to find a zipper that's exactly the same length as your vest. If you take a look at my vest, let me spin this around again. Okay, I managed to be spot on. My stop for my zipper ends right there at the neck where it should be, and then of course the bottom stop is right there at the bottom of the garment. That didn't happen by happy accident. I had to pre-plan that. So what I did is I measured the garment and tried to find a zipper that was as close as possible. When you can't find an exact size, you always want to go a little longer because it's usually easier to shorten it. Or you could go a little bit shorter as well. If you do that, then you're just going to need to shorten your garment to match. So try to, pre-plan that so that you get as close as possible. I'm going to show you in a minute how to shorten a zipper, so we'll take care of that issue right there. So again, this quilted fabric is a little bit fluffy because it's got batting in between. So let's go over to the machine and I'll show you how I did some of the construction, overcasting, and stitching. Okay, so what I have here is edges that need to be finished. And I'm going to just go ahead and use the regular foot, and I'm going to select an overcasting stitch. I'm going to go, let's see, one page down here. This happens to be one of my favorites for fabric that's a little bit thick. I'm going to increase the stitch width. Okay, and I'm going to increase the stitch length a little bit too because it's a bulkier fabric. So once I get that lined up on the edge, I'm just going to stitch a little bit so you can see how nice that will finish the raw edges. Because remember, this vest isn't lined. It's double-sided quilted fabric, so I don't have any lining to hide all of my seams. There's lots of different overcasting stitches. I choose the one that works best for my fabric. I'm sure you've got a great menu to choose from. Just take a look at your overcast stitches and always remember to make a little bit of a sample. I already made a sample of this, so I knew this one was going to work. Okay, we'll just do that part way. You can see how nice that is. It really clean finishes it. Of course, I'm using contrasting thread. On my seam finishes over the inside of my vest, I used gray. Did use black for the top stitching, but that's going to give you a really nice clean finish. So let me take that off and show you that nice and clean. If you didn't notice too, I still have my embroidery yarn. My embroidery arm on from doing that yarn. I just parked it over to the edge. So that allows me to do seam finishing on both sides. For the actual seams, I just used a standard straight stitch. But what about that zipper? Now, I told you there may be a time and a place when you need to shorten that. So I'm going to grab a foot that is called the button sewing foot, which may seem a little strange, but there's a method to my madness here, so stay tuned. I'm going to snap that foot on. Okay, and this would normally be the foot that we would use. I'm going to grab a sport zipper to sew buttons on. But what we do when we select the stitch, let me find the page with buttonholes and button sewing on it. Okay, that one is down here, right there. That is my button sewing stitch. It automatically is going to give me a bar tack. And what I'm doing is I'm replacing those stops at the top so that I can then have a thread bar tack there. So I'm just going to line that up right between the teeth. I'm going to hand walk that needle just to make sure I am between the teeth. And I am. And I'm just going to go ahead And I'm gonna do this twice because one bar tack is great for sewing a button on, but two makes it a little bit thicker. So there's a lot of button sewing possibilities. Using a button sewing foot, you can also check your machine to see if you have that same foot, or you can even use an open toe foot and just select a zigzag with your feed dogs down so that it makes a really close stitch. So you can see it's literally just a bar tack of thread, and watch what happens when I pull that zipper up. Oh, that did just what I wanted it to do. It stops it. So then the only other thing for me to do would be to remove the teeth, use some type of snips, whatever you have that works, and snip away those extra teeth, and then the tape can just be folded back like you normally would if you had a stop there. So it's really a great method for altering the zipper and not having to be, too concerned about finding that one that's exactly the right length. So let's go back over and take another little peek at the garment, and let me just tell you a few more details. We've got pockets here, so I just used lining for that, and that just makes a really nice lightweight finish. This is a warm, cozy vest to wear. It'll take you through cold weather. It'll take the chill off even on the indoor times when you just need that extra little layer. And adding that couching with embroidery really makes it special and really sets it off. So be sure to visit the website. You'll find complete instructions. You'll see all of the guidelines for yarns to choose so that you can make your own beautiful, cool weather vest.